Grief changes the way time moves. For some people, it speeds everything up. For others, it stops completely. For Thomas Bennett, time had frozen on a cold November morning 3 years ago. That was the day his wife died. Her name was Eleanor. And even now, 3 years later, speaking her name aloud still hurt. Cancer had taken her slowly, cruelly. By the end, Thomas barely recognized the woman lying in the hospital bed. The disease had stolen her strength, her laughter, her voice. But somehow, it never managed to take her kindness. Even during her final weeks, Eleanor worried more about other people than herself. That was who she was. That was who she had always been. 3 years later, Thomas still lived alone in the stone cottage they had shared near the English countryside village of Ashcombe. The house felt too large now, too quiet. Every room contained memories. The kitchen, where they drank coffee together. The fireplace where they spent winter evenings reading. The garden Eleanor loved more than anything. Sometimes Thomas caught himself expecting to hear her footsteps. Sometimes he turned toward a sound and forgot she was gone. Those moments hurt the most. Every Sunday morning, without fail, Thomas visited her grave. He brought fresh flowers, sat beside her headstone, and talked. Not because he believed she could hear him, but because it made him feel less alone. One gray autumn morning, he arrived carrying a bouquet of white lilies, Eleanor's favorite. The cemetery sat on a hill, overlooking rolling fields and distant forests. It was peaceful, quiet, the sort of place Eleanor would have loved. As Thomas approached the grave, he stopped. Fresh flowers already rested there, a beautiful arrangement of white roses. His stomach tightened. He looked around. Nobody. The cemetery was empty. Thomas knelt beside the grave. The roses looked recently placed, perhaps only hours old. There was no card, no note, no explanation, only flowers. For several minutes he stared at them. Then he carefully placed his lilies beside the roses. "Looks like someone got here before me," he said softly. The joke sounded pathetic even to him. Still, he smiled, just a little. Then he spent the next hour talking to Eleanor, about the weather, the village, his aching back, the neighbor's annoying dog, the meaningless details people share with someone they love. When he finally left, the mystery lingered in his thoughts. Who had brought the roses? He assumed it must be one of Eleanor's old friends. Perhaps someone from church. Perhaps a former co-worker. The explanation seemed reasonable. Until the following Sunday. Another bouquet waited. Different flowers. Same mystery. The Sunday after that, more flowers appeared. Then again. And again. Week after week. Always fresh. Always beautiful. Always anonymous. Thomas began arriving at different times. Earlier, later. Sometimes Saturday evening, sometimes Sunday afternoon. It didn't matter. The flowers were always there first, as though whoever brought them somehow knew exactly when he would arrive. The thought unsettled him. Months passed. Winter arrived. Snow covered the cemetery. Yet the flowers never stopped. Not once. Even during storms. Even during freezing temperatures. Someone always came. Someone always remembered Eleanor. Eventually, curiosity overcame grief. Thomas needed answers. One December morning, he arrived before sunrise. The cemetery was still dark. Frost coated the grass. His breath formed clouds in the cold air. He parked beneath an old oak tree and waited. Minutes passed. Then, an hour. Nothing. The sky slowly brightened. Thomas began to feel foolish. Then he saw movement. A figure entered through the cemetery gates. An elderly man. Tall, thin, wearing a long dark coat. The stranger carried white roses. Thomas watched carefully. The man walked directly toward Eleanor's grave. Not wandering, not searching, directly, as though he had visited hundreds of times before. Thomas remained hidden behind the oak tree. The stranger placed the flowers gently beside the headstone. Then he simply stood there, silent, motionless, for nearly 10 minutes. Thomas expected him to pray, or speak, or leave. Instead, the man just stared at the grave. The sadness in his posture felt overwhelming, almost unbearable. Then, something strange happened. The man reached forward and touched Eleanor's name carved into the stone, very gently, almost lovingly. Thomas felt a chill. Who was this person? The stranger lowered his head. For a moment, Thomas thought he was crying. Then the man turned and began walking away. Thomas immediately stepped out from behind the tree. "Excuse me." The man froze. Slowly, he looked back. Thomas expected surprise. Instead, he saw fear. Raw fear. The stranger stared at him for only a second before turning around and walking faster. Wait, Thomas followed. The elderly man quickened his pace, then suddenly disappeared behind a row of graves. Thomas hurried after him, but when he reached the spot, nobody was there. The man had vanished. It was impossible. There were no nearby exits, no vehicles, nothing. Yet somehow he was gone. Thomas stood alone among the graves, confused, uneasy, and more determined than ever. The following weeks became an obsession. Thomas began asking questions around the village. Nobody recognized the description. No one had seen an elderly man matching that appearance. Eventually he stopped mentioning it. People already thought grief had made him strange. He didn't need to encourage them. One rainy evening, Thomas searched through old photo albums, not looking for anything specific, simply hoping. Maybe the stranger had appeared in a photograph. Maybe Eleanor knew him. Hours passed. Nothing. Then he found something. A photograph taken nearly 20 years earlier. Eleanor stood beside a river, smiling. Behind her, partially visible, stood a man. Tall, thin, watching from a distance. Thomas sat upright. His pulse quickened. The man looked older now, but it was him. The same face, the same eyes, the same stranger from the cemetery. Thomas stared at the image. The photograph had been taken long before he met Eleanor, long before they married. Who was this man? Why was he watching her? And why was he still bringing flowers decades later? The answers felt buried somewhere in Eleanor's past, a past she had never fully shared. That realization disturbed him, not because he believed Eleanor had lied, because everyone carries secrets, even from the people they love most. The next afternoon, Thomas visited Eleanor's younger sister, Margaret. If anyone knew the truth, it would be her. Margaret studied the photograph carefully, then her expression changed. "What is it?" Thomas asked. Margaret hesitated. For a moment she seemed uncertain whether to speak. Finally she whispered, "Oh my God." Thomas felt his stomach drop. When Margaret looked up, paler than before. "I've seen him." The room suddenly felt colder. When Margaret swallowed, at Eleanor's funeral, silence filled the room. Thomas stared at her. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I thought I imagined it." She pointed at the photograph. That man stood at the back of the cemetery the entire service. Thomas felt his pulse hammering. Did Eleanor know him? Margaret slowly shook her head. "I don't know." Then she added something that made his blood run cold. "But Eleanor used to talk about someone." Thomas leaned forward. Who? Margaret looked toward the window, toward the darkening sky, then quietly said, "A man who watched over her from afar." Outside rain began tapping softly against the glass, and for the first time since Eleanor's death, Thomas wondered whether he had truly known the woman he married at all. The rain continued tapping against the window. Thomas sat across from Margaret, unable to speak. A man who watched over her from afar. The words settled into the room like fog. Margaret looked uncomfortable, as though she regretted saying it the moment it left her mouth. Thomas leaned forward. "What does that mean?" Margaret folded her hands tightly in her lap. "I don't know." "Margaret." She looked up. Her eyes were wet. "Eleanor never told me much." "Then tell me what she did say." For several seconds, Margaret remained silent. Outside, the rain grew heavier. Finally, she sighed. "Watched by who she never knew." That sounds frightening. It wasn't, though. Margaret shook her head slowly. That's the strange part. She never sounded afraid. More comforted. Thomas stared at her. Comforted? That made no sense. She told you someone was watching her, and she felt comforted, not in those words. Margaret looked down at the old photograph again. But she used to say that whenever she felt completely alone, flowers would appear. Thomas felt a chill. Flowers, yes. Where? Her school desk. The windowsill of her flat. Once outside the hospital after our mother died. Thomas's throat tightened. He had never heard any of this. Not once. And she never told me. Margaret's expression softened. Thomas, Eleanor loved you more than anyone. That doesn't answer my question. No. Margaret's voice became quiet. It doesn't. The honesty hurt. Thomas stood and walked toward the window. Beyond the glass, Ashcombe looked blurred by rain. The little village Eleanor had loved so much seemed suddenly unfamiliar. Every street, every shop, every stone wall, all of it now belonged to a past he didn't understand. Did she know who he was? Margaret hesitated. I think she suspected. Thomas turned sharply, Margaret's face tightened with uncertainty. Before she could answer, thunder rolled across the sky. Then she whispered a name, Arthur Vale. The name meant nothing to Thomas. Who is Arthur Vale? Margaret looked toward the photograph. I don't know if he was real. Thomas frowned. What? When we were children, Eleanor used to say that Arthur Vale was the name of her guardian angel. Thomas stared. A guardian angel, I know how it sounds. It sounds like something a child would invent. Maybe. Margaret's voice trembled. But years later, when Eleanor was 20, she received a letter. Thomas slowly sat again. What letter? Margaret stood and walked to a cabinet. From inside, she removed a small wooden box. She hesitated before placing it on the table. I kept some of Eleanor's things after she died. Thomas looked at the box. His chest tightened. Why didn't you tell me? Because I didn't think they mattered. She opened it. Inside were old postcards, photographs, a silver bracelet, and a bundle of yellowed envelopes tied together with ribbon. Margaret carefully removed one letter and handed it to Thomas. The handwriting was elegant, old-fashioned. The ink faded with time. Thomas opened it slowly. There was no address, no full name, only a short message. My dear Eleanor, forgive a coward who has only ever known how to love from a distance. You do not know me, and perhaps it is better that way. But I have watched over you since the day you were born, not because I wanted to haunt your life, but because I was too weak to enter it. If flowers have ever found you in your loneliest hours, know that they were never meant to frighten you. They were only my way of saying I was sorry. A. V. Thomas read the letter twice, then a third time. His hands began to shake. A. V. Arthur Vale. He looked up. How many letters? 4. Did Eleanor reply? Margaret nodded. Once. Thomas felt as if the ground had shifted beneath him. What did she say? I don't know. Margaret looked ashamed. I never read it. She sealed it and mailed it herself. Thomas held the letter carefully, as though it might break. Why would she keep this from me? Margaret's eyes filled with sadness. Maybe because she was afraid it would hurt you. It does hurt me, I know. Thomas looked down at the letter again. The words weren't romantic. Not exactly. They felt heavy, regretful, a confession without a confession. A man who loved from a distance. A man who sent flowers. A man who watched Eleanor from childhood to death. The idea made Thomas feel uneasy, not jealous, not quite. Something deeper, something more complicated. Eleanor had carried a secret grief he never knew existed. And that realization wounded him more than the stranger ever could. Over the next few days, Thomas became consumed by the name, Arthur Vale. He searched through old records, newspapers, church documents, village archives. Nothing came easily. Arthur Vale seemed almost non-existent. No local address, no family grave, no obvious connection to Eleanor. Then after hours inside the county records office, Thomas found an old birth certificate. Eleanor Rose Whitmore. Mother Helen Whitmore. Father blank. Thomas stared at the empty space. He had known Eleanor never spoke much about her father. She had always said he left before she was born. Thomas never pushed. Some wounds did not need questions. But now, the blank space looked less like absence, and more like concealment. He requested additional records. 2 days later, he found a marriage document connected to Eleanor's mother. Helen Whitmore had once been engaged to a man named Arthur James Vale. The engagement ended suddenly. No explanation. 3 months later, Helen left the village. 8 months after that, Eleanor was born. Thomas sat in the record office until closing time, the truth slowly forming in his mind. Arthur Vale wasn't a former lover, not Eleanor's secret romance, not some mad admirer. He was something else, something far more painful. He was likely Eleanor's father. The following Sunday, Thomas arrived at the cemetery before dawn again. This time he didn't hide. He stood beside Eleanor's grave and waited. Mist drifted across the grass. The morning air smelled of wet earth and old leaves. At exactly 6:14 a.m., the elderly man appeared, Arthur Vale. He entered through the iron gates carrying white roses. When he saw Thomas, he stopped. For a moment, they simply looked at one another. Two men connected by one woman they had both loved. Arthur turned as if to leave. "Don't." Thomas's voice was calm, tired. Arthur froze. "I only want to talk." The old man remained still. Then, slowly, reluctantly, he walked forward. Up close, he looked even frailer than Thomas remembered. His face was pale, his eyes red with sleeplessness. He held the roses in trembling hands. Thomas stepped aside. Arthur placed them gently on Eleanor's grave. Then he whispered, "Hello, my girl." The words broke something inside Thomas. Not because they were cruel, because they were full of love. Arthur stood silently for a long time. Finally, Thomas said, "You were her father." Arthur closed his eyes. A tear slipped down his cheek. "Yes." Thomas waited. The old man opened his eyes again. "I was." The cemetery seemed to fall silent around them. Even the birds had stopped singing. "Why didn't you tell her?" Arthur's lips trembled. "I tried. When too late." Thomas looked at Eleanor's name carved in stone. "That's not an answer." Arthur nodded. "No, it isn't." He took a shaky breath. "When Helen became pregnant, her family hated me. Why, I had nothing. No money. No name worth respecting." Arthur gave a bitter smile. "I was a gardener's son. Helen came from a family that believed love was something poor people invented because they couldn't afford comfort." Thomas said nothing. "They forced her away. Told me she wanted nothing to do with me. Told her I had abandoned her." His voice cracked. "By the time I learned the truth, Eleanor was already 5. Thomas felt anger rise. "Then why stay away?" Arthur looked at him. "Because Helen begged me to." The answer surprised Thomas. She said Eleanor had a stable life, a good school, a good future. She said if I appeared, I would only destroy what little peace they had. He looked down at the grave, and I believed her. Thomas clenched his jaw. "You watched her entire life from a distance." Arthur nodded. "I paid for what I could. School supplies, medical bills, flowers, when she was sad." Thomas remembered Margaret's words. "Flowers on lonely days." Arthur continued. "I thought one day I would be brave enough to tell her, but you weren't. No. The honesty was devastating. I was a coward." Thomas looked at him. "Did she know?" Arthur wiped his face. Near the end, Thomas went still. When Arthur reached into his coat pocket, he pulled out a folded letter. "She found me." Thomas stared at it. Arthur's hand shook as he offered the letter. "She wrote this after we met." Thomas hesitated, then took it. The paper felt old, but carefully preserved. Eleanor's handwriting covered the page. His heart ached at the sight of it. Arthur spoke softly. "She forgave me." Thomas looked up. The old man's voice broke. "But I never forgave myself." Thomas unfolded the letter. Before he could read it, a cold gust of wind swept through the cemetery. The roses stirred. One white petal broke loose and drifted onto Eleanor's headstone. For a moment, Thomas felt the strange sensation that they were not alone. Not exactly. Arthur looked toward the grave. His face changed. "What is it?" Thomas asked. The old man whispered, "She used to stand right there." Thomas followed his gaze. There was nothing. Only mist. Only morning light. Only Eleanor's grave. But then Thomas heard something. A woman's laugh. Soft. Familiar. Impossible. His breath caught. Arthur heard it too. The old man began to cry. Thomas stood motionless, Eleanor's letter trembling in his hand. And for the first time since her death, he wondered if some goodbyes were not meant to be final. Thomas stood beside Eleanor's grave with the letter trembling in his hands. The morning mist drifted low across the cemetery. Arthur Vale stood a few feet away, his face pale and wet with tears. For several seconds, neither man spoke. The sound they had both heard, Eleanor's laugh, had faded into the wind, but its echo remained. Thomas knew that laugh. He had heard it in kitchens, gardens, hospital rooms, and dreams. He had heard it when Eleanor was strong. He had heard it when she was dying. And now, standing in the cold cemetery, he had heard it again. Arthur whispered, "She forgave me." Thomas looked down at the folded letter. Eleanor's handwriting covered the page. For a moment, he was afraid to read it, afraid of discovering a part of her heart that had never belonged to him. But love, real love, was not possession. Eleanor had taught him that. Slowly, he unfolded the letter. Dear Arthur, I don't know how to begin a letter to a father I have only just met. Thomas felt his throat tighten. Arthur turned away, unable to watch. Thomas continued reading. For most of my life, I thought my father was a man who chose not to love me. That thought shaped me more than I ever admitted. It made me afraid of being left. It made me careful with trust. It made me grateful for every kindness, because some part of me always expected kindness to disappear. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment. He had known Eleanor was gentle. He had known she carried sadness, but he had never understood where it came from. The letter continued. When I learned the truth, I wanted to hate you. It would have been easier. Hate is simple. Grief is not. Arthur covered his face with one hand. Thomas kept reading. But I looked at you and saw an old man who had spent his whole life punishing himself. And I realized something. Pain does not become justice simply because we carry it long enough. A tear fell onto the paper. Thomas quickly wiped it away. I forgive you. Not because what happened was right, not because your silence did not hurt, but because I do not want the rest of my life to be ruled by someone else's fear. You were afraid. So was I. Maybe that is where we begin. Thomas lowered the letter. He could barely breathe. Arthur stood motionless. The old man's shoulders shook silently. There is more, Thomas said softly. Arthur nodded, though he did not turn around. Thomas continued. Please do not disappear again. If you cannot be my father from the beginning, perhaps you can still be something now. A friend, a witness, a man who finally stops hiding. And if one day I am gone, before you bring me flowers, white roses, not because you failed me, but because you loved me, in the only broken way you knew how. Thomas stopped reading. The cemetery was silent. Arthur slowly sank to his knees beside Eleanor's grave. I came every week, he whispered. Every week. Thomas looked at him. I know. I should have come sooner. Yes. Arthur nodded. The answer hurt him, but he accepted it. I should have held her when she was small. Yes. I should have told her she was wanted. Thomas's voice broke. Yes. Arthur pressed his trembling hand against the headstone. I'm sorry, my girl. The words came out like a prayer. Thomas stood beside him. For the first time, he did not see a stranger. He saw an old man ruined by regret, a man who had lost a daughter twice, once by silence, once by death. Over the next few weeks, Thomas and Arthur began meeting, every Sunday. At first, they only stood beside the grave. Two grieving men, separated by history, united by Eleanor. They spoke little, then slowly words came. Arthur told Thomas stories from the edges of Eleanor's life. How he had watched her school concerts from the back of the hall. How he had secretly paid for her art lessons when Helen could no longer afford them. How he had sent flowers after Eleanor's mother died. How he had once stood outside the church on Thomas and Eleanor's wedding day, but did not enter. Thomas hated him for that, then understood him, then hated him again. Grief was not clean. Forgiveness was not a single moment. It came and went like weather. Some Sundays, Thomas felt compassion. Other Sundays, he wanted to shout. Arthur never defended himself. That helped. One afternoon, Thomas invited him to the cottage, the house Eleanor had loved. Arthur stood at the doorway for a long time before entering. She lived here. Thomas nodded. For 15 years. Arthur stepped inside carefully, as if entering a chapel. His eyes moved across the room. The fireplace, the bookshelves, the photographs, the vase on the windowsill. He stopped in front of a framed picture of Eleanor in the garden. She was laughing, wind in her hair, sun on her face. Arthur touched the frame gently. She looked happy. Thomas swallowed. She was. Arthur looked at him. Thank you. Thomas didn't know what to say, so he said nothing. They spent the afternoon in Eleanor's garden. It had become overgrown since her death. Thomas had tried to maintain it, but grief made even simple things difficult. Arthur, despite his age, knelt in the soil and began clearing weeds. Thomas watched him for a while, then joined him. Neither spoke. They worked side by side until evening. By sunset, a small patch of the garden looked alive again. It was not much, but it was something. Winter gave way to spring. The cemetery changed. The fields beyond the hill turned green. Birdsong returned to the village. Thomas still missed Eleanor every day. That did not change. But the grief shifted. It became less like drowning, more like carrying a heavy coat. Still present, still warm with memory, but not impossible. Arthur grew weaker as the months passed. He coughed often. His hands shook more. One Sunday he failed to appear. Thomas waited at the cemetery for nearly an hour before driving to the small rented room where Arthur lived. He found the old man sitting by the window, a blanket over his knees, white roses beside him. "I couldn't make it," Arthur said. His voice sounded thin. Thomas sat beside him. "I can take them." Arthur nodded. For a while they watched the rain fall outside. Then Arthur spoke. "Do you think she truly forgave me?" Thomas looked at him. He thought of Eleanor's letter, her kindness, her impossible capacity to understand wounded people. "Yes." Arthur closed his eyes. "Then why do I still feel unforgiven?" Thomas was quiet for a long time. "Because you haven't forgiven yourself." Arthur smiled sadly. "I don't know how." Thomas looked toward the roses. "Maybe you start by believing her." The old man began to cry, not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, like someone finally too tired to hold back the sea. 3 weeks later, Arthur died in his sleep. Thomas was the only person at his funeral. There were no family members, no old friends, no mourners, just Thomas, a priest, and a bouquet of white roses. At first, Thomas felt anger, at life, at time, at all the chances people missed because fear spoke louder than love. Then he placed the roses on Arthur's grave and whispered, "She knows." The following Sunday, Thomas returned to Eleanor's, grave alone. For the first time in months, there were no flowers waiting before him, no mysterious bouquet, no silent stranger, only the headstone, only the grass, only Eleanor's name beneath the morning light. Thomas stood there, holding white lilies. His old routine had returned, but he was not the same man who had once arrived confused by roses. He knelt and placed the lilies gently on the grave. Then after a moment, he added one white rose beside them. "For him," he whispered. The wind moved softly through the cemetery. Somewhere in the trees, a bird began to sing. Thomas sat beside the grave for a long time. He told Eleanor about the garden, about Arthur, about the anger he still carried, about the peace he was trying to learn. Then he smiled faintly. "You had a way of bringing broken people together," he said. The breeze stirred the flowers. One white rose petal loosened and drifted across the grass. Thomas watched it move. For a brief second, he imagined Eleanor standing beside the old stone wall, not as a ghost, not as a memory, but as the feeling she had always left behind. Kindness, forgiveness, love that refused to vanish. Thomas closed his eyes. And this time, when he whispered goodbye, it did not feel like losing her again. It felt like finally letting her rest. From that day on, he brought 2 bouquets every Sunday. White lilies for his wife, white roses for the father who had loved her too late. And though the cemetery remained quiet, Thomas never again felt completely alone.